Welcome back to the Fuel Your Legacy podcast. Each week, we expose the faulty foundational mindsets of the past and rebuild a newer, stronger foundation essential in creating your meaningful legacy. We've got a lot of work to do, so let's get started. As much as you like this podcast, I'm certain that you're going to love the book that I just released on Amazon, Fuel Your Legacy, The 9 Pillars to Build a Meaningful Legacy. I wrote this to share with you the experiences that I had while I was identifying my identity, how I began to create my meaningful legacy, and how you can create yours. You're going to find this book on Kindle, Amazon, and as always on my website, samknickerbocker.com. Welcome back to the Fuel Your Legacy show. We're excited to have on this week's guest, Michelle Jewsbury. I actually went to a coaching seminar. I go to a lot of seminars. Anything I can do to level up my game, I'm doing it. And she was up on stage on a panel and shared her story. And instantly I just knew it'd be a perfect fit for this podcast. And I asked her, hey, would you be willing to give me some of your time, 45 minutes an hour, so we could get your message out there and share it because it's so powerful. And thankfully she said yes in a few months. And that's why we're almost in February recording this. You won't hear this probably till maybe April or May, but she has just done so much in life. It's going to be hard to kind of summarize this, but ultimately she really has a mission to help people who's been through domestic violence of various sorts, people who feel like they've been silenced and not been able to share and really share their story and get the help that they need, either through personal experience or other experiences. She's going to share a lot about that. What are some of the obstacles that people go through, the breakthroughs that are necessary to, one, be willing to share if you're in that position, what things are you struggling with personally, and why wouldn't you go help yourself and share that, but also how to help others who may be going through that. So so excited to share this with you. First, share something that nobody knows about you, right? Not too secret, not too personal, but something that few people know about you.
I love the water, and I love sports that are dangerous. So I'm a danger seeker. So I love, I want to go skydiving. I scuba dive all the time. I've been, of course, parasailing and bungee jumping. But I love extreme sports. So skiing, you name it.
Cool. Awesome. So what we're going to do, I'm going to have you just introduce yourself and give a lot more history of your background, kind of where you came from, what got you into following this passion, and where it's taken you in traveling and the people you've been able to help.
Great. Yeah. So my name is Michelle Jewsbury, and I was brought up in a wonderful household with a loving mom and dad, and I've got a younger brother as well. My daddy was in the military, so I didn't see him often growing up. So my mom pretty much raised us when my daddy worked a lot. I mean, my mom worked as well, but she was the primary caregiver. And, we moved around a lot. My father was military, so I've been to like 6 different schools at least, and I learned how to make friends and then leave. So it was troubling, but it was our life. And we were brought up knowing that our family would stick by each other and we would help each other out. Well, fast forward a little bit, my mom trained me in the restaurant industry, and I had spent over 12 years in the restaurant industry, from hosting to serving, bartending, and managing. And I knew that I wanted something more. I knew that there was something more out there for me. So roughly 2011, I moved to California to pursue an acting career. I love acting. And I was doing well. I was producing my own shows, and it was going great. So I was on my way. And then I met this beautiful man, blue-eyed, blonde hair, swept me off my feet. So we started dating roughly the beginning of 2012, and 4 months into the relationship, my head went through the drywall. So that's kind of what started propelling me in the direction I am now. I didn't realize or understand what I was going through. I didn't understand that it was the beginning of a domestic violence relationship. I never experienced that. My parents didn't hit each other. I wasn't hit as a child. I mean, the occasional spanking, but I wasn't beat. And this was something that I had no idea how to get out of. I also had no idea what it was. So I stayed with him roughly 4 years. And in those 4 years, I was beat multiple times, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, and of course, physical abuse. Much of the emotional manipulation kept me there. Well, when I finally escaped, I started documenting what happened to me. And when I started documenting, that started coming out in a play format because my background in theater. And I wrote and performed a 65-minute solo show in 2016, all about my experience in my abusive relationship. Because I did that, so many people, primarily women, but a lot of men as well, came up to me and told me their stories about domestic violence, about what they've gone through. And I started to realize and understand that I'm not alone. And there are hundreds of thousands of people all over the world that experience this. So I decided that I wanted to do something more. And I ended up starting a nonprofit organization called Unsilenced Voices in 2017. We help survivors of domestic violence, sexual abuse, and now we're starting to be advocates against sex trafficking worldwide. We're in Ghana and Sierra Leone, Africa. We're expanding to Nepal, and we're doing our first ever event in Los Angeles in the US area, May 30th. So super stoked about that. But I knew that I needed to speak up. I knew I needed to be the voice that, to give voice to the voiceless. And I then started developing a course called our Masterclass, where we help people overcome obstacles. Because a lot of people experience trauma, depression. Top level CEOs, for example, 30% of them have severe depression. So how do we break free from that? And then you also have to look at the statistics for domestic violence. In your workforce, 1/3 of the women to 1/4 of the women experience domestic violence. And then we're also talking about 1 to 10, 1 to 11 men experience it as well. So that's kind of how I started on the trajectory where I am now.
That is just so crazy. There's so many ins and outs of that I'm sure you're keeping out of the story, having gone through that. Yeah, no, none of it. I just told you everything that happened to me.
Well, I've got to let you ask me some questions.
Right? I know. So I'm curious, when you say, 4 months into this relationship, you experience this tragic. In my mind, that's tragic. Your head goes through a wall. It's not like a small deal. It's not, you're like, oh yeah, that's normal. What was the psychological process of, I got to figure. So I have this premise in my head. We'll start with this. Okay. I have a premise in my head that we have very small, few moments in our life that end up dictating our lives. And often those moments come in either times of extreme elation or ecstasy, that are like deep emotional, or like from a neuropsychological perspective, searing certain highways in our brain of how things are going to happen. So we have these emotional reactions and they're very brief. And then our body switches into, and because of protection, either fight or flight, or stand still and just let it happen, or remove yourself from the emotional attachment to your body so that no matter what's happening to your body, it's not happening to you emotionally, right? So there's different ways that we deal with different types of abuse, but not just abuse. We deal with this with happiness. We deal with this in all different areas of our lives. We have this small moment of reaction, of feeling, and then immediately our body switches into how are we going to interpret this feeling? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I want to know is, what was that moment for you? At what point did the feeling of extreme betrayal or feeling of like, what the heck is going on, and the deep rejection, when was that in that story? Okay. And then what did you go to as far as how did you deal with explaining that to yourself?
So that very first incident, I told myself that Paul, we'll call him Paul, he was just super stressed at work, that it was an accident, that it was a mishap, that I must have triggered him some way. And what's crazy is there was emotional manipulation that led up to this very first incident. And that emotional manipulation was him, blaming me for things. Our relationship started off wonderful. He courted me, flowers, we went to ball games, we laughed, we danced. But his praises slowly turned into insults. And it was like a Jekyll and Hyde. So he would show his vulnerable side and show how amazing he was out in public. And then behind closed doors, he would still show that side, except he would also start putting me down. Like, why are you doing that? That's stupid. Don't be an idiot. You deserve more than that. Things like that, where I started to question myself and my values and what I wanted in my life. So when that first thing happened, when he pushed me so hard and my head went through the wall, I literally walked back and then turned around and looked at the big dent, and I was like, I gotta patch that. That was the only thing that I thought. I gotta patch that. And I did. That's what I did, right? And then slowly but surely it got worse. The physical abuse, the emotional abuse, it all got worse. And I'm a very strong, independent woman. I came from a great household. Of course, we all have some issues growing up, so some of that impacted me allowing myself to stay in that abusive relationship. But I so badly wanted that relationship with Paul. I loved him so much, and I was willing to sacrifice myself on some levels in order to stay, without understanding he was destroying me.
Yeah, I think the key things there. This is exactly why I asked the question. And I got the response that I thought I would get, but I asked it the way I did intentionally. That feeling of blame, shame, guilt, all of those things generally are happening before these bigger experiences. So when I asked, hey, what was that time that you were where you initially felt betrayed, when you initially felt that, it was probably months, or I don't know how long, at least weeks before this, where he started saying, well, you deserve better than that. Why are you doing that? Don't be an idiot, right? It's those little comments that are programming our brain that type of behavior is okay from this individual. And we do a cost benefit analysis, guys. And to ignore that we do this is well, it's just naive at best, right? We do a cost benefit analysis. What's the benefit of this relationship versus if I leave, what's the cost? What do I lose, right? And to one level or another, not necessarily on this level, but no matter what relationship you're in, there's no Prince Charming out there who never has a bad day. There's no Rapunzel or whatever who never has a bad day. Look, no matter what relationship you're going to be in, there is sacrifice. There is a level of, they're not everything that I think I would want necessarily. Like, they have their weird quirks, but those quirks aren't hurting me. Those quirks are just like, for instance, my wife, when we first met, she would wash the dishes with cold water. That doesn't not make sense to me because it's cold water, right? But in her mind, it made sense. And I was like, okay, whatever, right? Like, there's going to be some differences where you're just like, okay, that's different. But those circumstances don't necessarily have to lead to being disrespected. Definitely not abuse in any form. So understand there's going to be differences in a relationship, but there is a line between differences and abuse.
And sometimes it's a fine line, right? So I speak all around the world, and I've been on KTLA and lots of news stations, Good Morning San Diego, and you name it, right? And a lot of what they ask is these red flags. And there are red flags. However, it's a fine line distinguishing between the red flags that are going to lead to an abusive relationship and the red flags of just, a dick, right? Yeah. There's a difference there. Somebody that you should be with or somebody that you shouldn't be with, right? So when Paul, for instance, started to put me down, slyly put me down, I really thought initially that it was him just giving me his advice, right? But that advice really turned into like derogatory insults. And that's where, if you're listening to this podcast, that's where you really got to assess your relationship and look at everything that's happening and look at how he or she is treating you, but also the people around them, right? So it's really important to be able to distinguish that line.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely agree, because it's those smaller moments that lead up to, then we're in this abusive situation, and it, as she said, her thought was not anything like, oh, that shouldn't have happened, why did he treat me this way? Immediately her thought was, I must have caused that, which again, this is another fine line where I'm like, I love that thought process. How am I responsible for this? Not because I want somebody to feel the guilt and shame of being abused, right? That's not the purpose of asking, how am I responsible for this? The purpose of asking, like, how am I responsible for this, is so that you can determine, if I don't want this to continue happening, what am I going to change, right? I'm clearly in this situation. Nobody forced me into this situation necessarily. There are choices that I made. And if I'm getting out, what choices am I going to make in the future? These are the deep learning experiences if we use that way. So I think it's important to ask yourself that question, how am I responsible for this? But not from a guilt or shame perspective, but from what am I going to learn from this type perspective?
Yeah, exactly. And there's a reason why people stay in abusive relationships. And, it all stems from childhood and adolescence, nature, nurture, controversy. But yeah, even me, I'm responsible to the level of, I allowed myself to stay. And I allowed myself to stay because of some attachment disorders that I had that I didn't know I had at the time. But it wasn't my fault that it happened to me. Right. And that's what you're saying, Sam. Your audience, the people who are listening, if you've been in an abusive relationship or you are in an abusive relationship, it's not your fault. But now you got to take that step forward to get out of it.
Right. And I think for me, I had a long conversation with my brother, because he was talking about coaches and how he thinks it's bad and wrong that a coach charges X amount of dollars for coaching. And then what if that person that got charged that money doesn't do the coaching? And so now they're in a bunch of debt or whatever. They wasted a bunch of money and they don't get their money back. And he's saying, well, then it's the coach's fault for not giving their money back. I'm like, no. And it's not even the guy's fault who paid the money and didn't do it. There's no fault per se. There simply is what is. Yeah. And how are you going to respond to it? How are you going to refuse to be a victim in a mentality and say, no, I'm choosing only to be an active agent who can control my environment? That's the only question, really. How are you choosing to control and create your environment versus allow your environment to be created by somebody else?
Yeah.
And so what I'm curious about is, how did you know to speak up? Because there's so many people who get in these relationships and even get out of these relationships, but rather than doing what you did and actually start speaking up about it, they hide it still. They're like, okay, well, that one was gone. Let's just focus on going and finding somebody better, or whatever they tell themselves, right? But how did you know that speaking up would be a healthy thing for you?
Well, I didn't at the time. In the very beginning, when I started documenting what happened to me, it just kind of came out in a play format. And I just knew that I needed to get it out, right? And get it out of my body, my soul. Writing therapy is something that we are huge advocates for. And then emotional therapy, right? I ended up seeing a psychologist for over 4 years. And from there, I felt this calling, this innate desire within me to speak up, right? Because injustices happen all over the world. And in order to change these injustices, we have to talk about them. Well, when it came out in play format, it was very therapeutic when I literally beat myself up on stage. And I knew that I had to keep going. And I was scared. I was so scared because my abuser was a very, very powerful guy. And he would threaten me, threaten my life. He's threatened my life multiple times, threatened to kill my family. And he had a lot of money and power behind him. And I knew that if I spoke up, it was going to cause him to get really angry. And I had no idea what was going to happen. So I remember I moved out of the place that I was at for a very long time. And I moved into an apartment building. And I didn't put my actual address on anything because I was fearful that I would come up in those elevators and either him or somebody that he's hired would be on the other side with a Glock and that I would be harmed, right? I would think that, but I still knew I had to speak up. Well, lo and behold, that never happened. And now I'm super stoked that I spoke up, but it's so important to get it out, right? And you don't have to speak up publicly if that's something that you're uncomfortable with, but you have to get it out of your soul.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it's interesting because it really takes a lot of courage to speak up and share some of those deeper emotions for personal experience, right? I I grew up in a family of 11, and there was levels of abuse. There was levels of physical abuse, domestic violence type abuse, and then a lot of emotional manipulation, gaslighting. I mean, just a whole range of things. And being where I am now, all of our family, my parents are still married, never got divorced, thank goodness. All of our family love each other as far as I'm aware. And I have nothing but love and respect for my parents. And I understand that what went on was not good and nobody should go through that. And I don't hold it against them. They're different humans now. They operate differently. They respond like everything's different now than it was then. And so I can separate the two beings and I can forgive, right? And forgiveness doesn't always mean that you remain in the situation of where you're at. Some people think, oh, I can't forgive them because that means I'm condoning their behavior. I'm allowing it. No, it doesn't. Like, you cannot allow hatred to be in your body and still avoid and not participate in things with people who are causing you harm. I mean, it's a big difference there.
And forgiveness is a really, really difficult thing. I had such a hard time forgiving Paul because, I mean, I was emotionally abused, you name it. But that was also the best and the worst relationship I've ever had. And I remember after escaping, I used to sit in the back of church and just cry my eyes out because at first I hated him. I was so angry, right? So angry at what had happened. And then I started to let go, unclench my fists and let go of what happened to me and give it up to whatever you believe, what I believe, give it up to God, right? And because of that, then I started to understand that hurt people hurt people. And although I was a victim in that relationship, he was also a victim in prior relationships with his family, whatever that looks like, right? Yeah. He was also hurt. So I forgave him. I said, it doesn't make it right. It's not that I ever want to get back together with that man, but I forgave him for what he did. Mm-hmm. And it's so important to do that because when you hold a grudge, when you're so angry, then it's really in you that you have those feelings. Holding a grudge and not forgiving somebody doesn't hurt the other person, right? It only hurts you. So you have to forgive them in order to forgive yourself and move on.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the hard part for somebody who's listening to this is if you're stuck in that cycle right now, the last thing you want to hear is what Michelle just said. I get that. And I just invite you to journal, like if you're driving, if you're sitting in your house, whatever, sit down and journal. Like, why does that trigger you? Like, what about what she just said triggers you? And really explore that. You might need a box of tissues. You might need a punching bag or a pillow, right? But really allow yourself to feel and explore, not hurting anybody else, but explore why those things trigger you. Because that self-discovery is where I believe you're going to gain some of the most insight of yourself and the most love for yourself and others. And I think Compassion is huge there. So I had this experience with my family growing up, and I decided last year, or maybe, yeah, it was last year, I was getting on stage. I was going to share this experience, and I invited my mom and dad to be there. And afterwards, like, well, that's not really how I remember it, right? Which this is a key. The reason I'm sharing this specifically is there's going to be times, especially if you're in this type of situation, where the way you experience something may or may not be actually what factually happened. Your memory of that event and your interpretation of what happened may or may not be even close to factually accurate. And it doesn't really matter. I think it would really matter if in a court of law you're trying to put somebody in prison. At that point, we need to know what the facts are. And only because we need to know what the fate of this person is. Short of that, it doesn't really matter what the facts are to you or to them. What matters is what was your experience of it, and what story are you telling yourself about who you are because it happened. That's what really matters. And so, like Michelle said, it was therapeutic, not only for me to go up and share these experiences on stage, but also I believe it helps my parents see more of where I'm coming from and see that as bad as my perception of that was, there's still an immense amount of love and forgiveness and compassion for them. And there's movement. I've moved past that, and that doesn't have to be part of our relationship or define our relationship. And that's important part of healing for all parties involved, I believe.
Yeah, no, it's very, very imperative. And forgiveness is definitely key to growth.
Yeah, that's awesome. So when you were first decided, hey, I'm going to go do this on stage, did you have people who, I mean, obviously you kind of already said you were scared for your life, but do you have other people who were like, that's a bad idea, don't do that, and kind of naysayers telling you that that you maybe shouldn't pursue that therapy the way you wanted to?
Well, so yes and no. Oftentimes I had people be like, well, aren't you scared? Why are you doing that? That's stupid to speak up. You could get really hurt. But it's the same naysayers who tell me that I shouldn't go to Africa, right? And those naysayers don't lead the life that I want to live. And that's very important. You listen to the people that you want their lives. You don't listen to people who are not living the life you want. And what I mean by that is that a lot of people give you unwarranted advice. And that unwarranted advice is none of their damn business. Mm-hmm. And we don't want their advice because they're not living the wonderful, amazing, successful, financially free life that we want. So why the heck are we going to listen to them? So that's what I thought the whole time. So when people were telling me, well, don't do this or don't do that, I'm like, I'm going to go with how I feel I'm being led. And you can say whatever the heck you want about it, but I'm doing it.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that comes, that type of commitment can also come from being in such a bad place and already having to make a decision to get out of that. You're just stacking wins in your favor as you continue to follow how you feel. And I say that because if you're in this type of situation and you're like, okay, how do I deal with this? Sometimes it's as bad as Michelle's was, and there's a need to actually intensely remove yourself from the situation. Sometimes it's not that bad. Like I had a situation where I felt that I was being, for lack of a better word, manipulated by a superior in my work environment. And because of my past experiences from my childhood, then that type of communication really doesn't align with me, and I'll wall up and I ignore. And like the problem is, if that person has information that I need and want from a business perspective, then I need to find a way to make that relationship work. Yeah. And it wasn't like it was physically harming me necessarily, but it was suppressing my ability to perform in my best levels if I have these types of people around me. And so rather than removing myself from the situation, moving to another city, going to another company, rather than doing that, I simply went and sat down, talked to him, and explained. I chose to be vulnerable first, explained my situation, explained These are my boundaries. If you continue to treat me this way, then I will have to remove myself from the situation, right? Like if you can't respect my boundaries, then at that point I know you have zero respect for me, and then I can walk away. But there's a lot of times where we get offended, or we feel like we're being emotionally abused or physically abused or whatever, and so we're having all these feelings inside of ourselves, and we're never doing the decency to the other person to even let them know that we're feeling these ways. And then we start feeling this animosity, this anger, this resentment towards these people who are quote unquote abusing, manipulating, gaslighting us. But we never even let them know that that's how we were feeling. In that situation, I will not allow you to claim victimhood in that situation, because you didn't even try. Like you didn't even attempt to have a real conversation. And it's important to understand the distinction where you've done your best to get out. Now, there's going to be people who are just malicious people. Okay. Get away from them. They're not serving you. But there's a lot of people who, because they were raised to communicate a certain way, that's how they communicate. There's a lot of people who don't like the way I communicate. That's fine. I never lock them in my office or anything. They're free to go whenever they want. And I don't feel the need to change who I am. And that's okay for me. But I don't intentionally hurt people.
Yeah.
But if somebody said, hey, this is hurtful, then I'm going to make a decision. Well, you can avoid me for the rest of your life. That's fine. I'm not going to change who I am. Or I can say, well, that's not really how I meant for that to come across. This is what I meant. Hopefully we can move past this, right?
Yeah.
But you need to have your own boundaries and know who you are.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's interesting. So
and that's why important for sure, because that's why the nonprofit is called Unsilenced Voices, because people need to speak, people need to use their words. Communication is key to change, right? Communication and collaboration. So you've got to be able to communicate even with those people that you don't want to talk to, right? So it is, you gotta speak up. You've gotta tell the world what is wronging you. And then there's a great book out, and it's called Boundaries. And it's a really good book to read, listen to if you want to, that talks about some of the boundaries that we should put in place, and how sometimes that line gets crossed because we're not stern with our boundaries, and we need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you were in this relationship, were you earning income as well? Were you just completely living off of his income? How did that work when you just left? Because I'm assuming you were no longer living at home or even close to your parents at that point.
No. So I had moved to Hollywood to pursue an acting career. My parents weren't around here. So when I started dating him, he didn't live in Hollywood. So I ended up moving in with him roughly 4 or 5 months, somewhere around the same time that my head went through that wall, moving in with him. And then he didn't want me working. So this was the control tactic. So he was very set financially. He made a lot of money. He was very successful, right? And he tried to encourage me not to work, and then he put it as an ultimatum. Well, you have to quit your job, because if you go to work right now, then we're done. So then he forced me to quit. And I didn't work. I was bored. I was very, very bored. But I was also walking on eggshells the whole time around him. So I would pick up the house. I would manage the cleaners. I would take care of the dogs. But I couldn't work. So there were some times where I didn't have any money, and this was the financial abuse. He had me add his name to all of my credit cards, so we could use our credit cards for all of the expenses. Now, I did that listening to him, right? So then we used my credit cards for everything. Well, he would tell me that he would pay them off, and then he didn't pay them off. And he left me with a boatload of debt. His name was on it, but my name was first, so the creditors really, looked at me. And when I had no cash or no income, sometimes I would feel in his pockets when I was putting away his clothing to see if there was any cash, because I had no money. And it was really crazy, because we were living in a nice home. He was pulling in, hundreds of thousands of dollars, but I was broke, right? And I didn't have access to any of the funds. So when I escaped, I ended up coming back to the restaurant industry, thank God I had that training early on because it was an easy in, right? Especially in the LA area. You can get a job as a server or a bartender almost anywhere. And then I started making that income, and that's, that's small income. But then, of course, now speaking and traveling, and now I'm financially able to do whatever the heck I want to do. But at first, no, I was very much controlled by
Yeah, that's I when I'm working with people going through some of these mental struggles, it's really important to me to make sure that both spouses are completely understand where their money is. It's important that they both understand how it's being spent. I've been started working with more and more couples, and it's fascinating as you'll sit down with them, especially when they're not married, they're just living together, or they are married but their finances are separate, whatever the case may be, and you'll hear this like, oh well, she spends too much on clothes, she wastes her money here, and then they'll say, oh well, they spend their money on toys and they're wasting their money on gambling or whatever, and there's all this like almost judgment about how each other spends money.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so majorly unhealthy. And so a lot of what I do is just helping people learn to communicate about money on a level of what do they value. And I'm not here to tell somebody if something is a good or bad expenditure. I'm just here to show you actually how you're spending your money and ask you if it aligns with your values. And if it does, great. If it doesn't, well, what would need to change? And it's interesting to see how people can soften their communication about that. But anytime where one person is, in this situation, completely dependent on the other person financially, even if accounts were to get set up, I would encourage everybody to still maintain ownership of all of their own things, not to have your spouse own anything financially for you. That's my that's how I help my clients, because there's a time to share stuff, but there's also a time where it's like you just never know what can happen. And the financial abuse, it's a real thing. And if they're not aware of like that's a possibility, then they're just not. I mean, it's a business contract. A marriage contract is a business contract, and people need to understand the financial implications of a marriage contract.
Yeah, I mean, there are certain relationships where sharing the finances makes sense, right? And then there's certain relationships where it doesn't, because one person will control the other person, and that's when it's unhealthy. And that's what happened to me. Is that I literally he ended up leasing me a vehicle that I wasn't even allowed to drive. I was driving around a beat up old pickup truck for a while because he thought that I wasn't grateful for him getting me a car, although the car was also in my name. So it was really rough. And then that third year, I ended up leaving, and we stayed in contact for that fourth year, where he was still financially abusing me, emotionally manipulating me, but we weren't physically together. And it was so crazy. I had lost my dad that year, and then I also tore my ACL that year and needed knee surgery. And he would say, "Oh, I'm going to take care of you. Don't worry about anything. I've got you." Like all of this stuff to manipulate me to believe that he was going to pay off these bills, these debts. And lo and behold, he never did.
Yeah, that's crazy. So get financially educated yourself. I don't care who you are in the relationship, whether you're the one who's sitting at home and not earning money. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that's not a bad thing, and that I'm not saying that's a bad thing. If that's what makes you happy and everything's good, that's fine. But I believe that it's still your responsibility to understand where the money is, how it works, and just how money works in general, how credit works in general. Like there's certain things just about life. Imagine if you couldn't read or write, like, or your spouse couldn't read or write. Like that's what it's like if you're financially illiterate. It's the equivalent of not being able to read or write. How would you feel about being in a relationship where you're the one who can't read or write and you have to have somebody else read and write everything for you? It's like there's just so much room, even if it's like not maliciously, there's just so much room for misunderstanding across the board. it's important to get to the point where you understand how money works and start at least understanding it. Even if you're not practicing it, if you ever have to practice it, you should be able to.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. But when you're trapped in something, in an abusive relationship, trauma, just the first thing is get yourself out. Secure an exit strategy. Figure out how to save yourself, save your children. Don't stay because of your kids. Don't stay in a relationship that's harmful because of some external reason. And a lot of, going back to money, a lot of people do stay because of the money. A lot of people also stay because they don't know how they're going to gain any. And then when you're in that relationship, it's really hard. But there are, especially in the United States, there are services, there are shelters, there are places that you can go. I worked on Skid Row for 6 months at the Downtown Women's Center, and amazing organization. And women would go there to get resources, talk to case managers, get clothing for interviews, be able to integrate back into the workforce. They had study preps, they had, resume coaching, you name it. So there are resources to help you integrate. So if you are listening to this podcast and you are in an abusive relationship, or you have experienced some type of traumatic incident, you don't have to stay stuck in your circumstances. You can get out, and it's healthy to get out for sure.
Yeah, 100%. So after you got out, you did the play. How did you take yourself from there to now being able to travel the world and create this influence for the world? Really, it's not just for America; it's all over the world. What was that transition like? And when did you decide, okay, my story is not just for me and the few people who are coming up to me, but my story is really an international one that needs to be shared, and we can make a movement out of it?
Yeah, so after I had wrote my play and performed my play, when I said that, multiple people came up to me and just started to relate with me about their experiences and how they've been in the same situation. I started to understand that, wow, I'm not alone, and I'm speaking up, and I need to continue speaking up. And I didn't really know I was going to start my own nonprofit. So I was working as vice president for another nonprofit called Young Vision Africa, and they were based in the U.S. but worked in Sierra Leone. So I took a trip to Sierra Leone. When was this? This must have been 2016. And I was able to talk to women about domestic violence issues because that's what I had experienced. And I started to understand how bad, how severe it was overseas. And I was like, okay, I've got to do something. So when I got back to the States after that trip, I left YVA and started working at the Downtown Women's Center for 6 months, volunteering my time twice a week on Skid Row. And then I started interviewing for other nonprofits. And one in particular called Art and Abolition, amazing nonprofit organization that works in Kenya to rescue young children who sell their bodies for a bag of rice. And I flew up to Oakland. It was a great meeting. I got to meet a lot of the board members, and I'm a spiritual woman, so I felt God's presence within the organization, but I didn't feel like I was supposed to be there. So the next day I walk around the streets of San Francisco, have my wine and my clam chowder, and God sent me a sign. He sent me this guy. We started talking, and he said, you should start a nonprofit. And I said, well, that's not the first time I heard this, so this is the time I probably should listen. And we were a 501c3 within a month, and a month later I was in Ghana. And it's all through just meeting people. The reason we went to Ghana first is because one of our board members, Dr. Bennett Annan, is Ghanaian, and I ended up meeting him through an acquaintance of mine. And he's like, you can just go stay at my family's place in Ghana. And I said, okay. So I did. And then that's how we started there. And now we've got 6 partners between Ghana and Sierra Leone. We have a partner in Nepal, and we are growing our partnerships with multiple organizations here in the United States. So this is a movement. This is something that won't stop, right? And then I published my first book called But I Love Him, which is the same title as my play. I published that in February of 2019, last year. And for your listeners, if you would like to receive a complimentary digital download of the introduction of the book, all you got to do is text obstacles to 26786.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that right there is so crucial for people to. I'm gonna talk about the overall principle of this right here.
Mhm.
When you take a step out, it's darkness a lot of the time, right? When you're going out of your comfort zone, it's like, where am I going? And it doesn't matter. The question is, are you willing to go where you're led, or are you going to question everything? If you're questioning everything, it's going to be really hard to grow. We look at people who are very successful by, I mean, it doesn't matter at what stage you are. Maybe you're a multimillionaire and you're like, man, well, what does it take to be a billionaire, right? What does it take to be earn $100,000 a year? What does it take to earn $50,000 a year? It doesn't matter where you're at on that scale. You look at somebody who you deem as successful, and what's the difference between them and you? And I would say almost always, in my experience, the difference is who takes action faster and is willing to trust their movements. And those people, they have more opportunity. And I'm saying that in like quotation, air quotes, because they don't have more opportunity. They see more opportunity and they act on more opportunity than you do. But in my opinion, everybody has opportunity. The question is, are you open to seeing the opportunity and are you willing to act on it when you do see it?
Yeah, you definitely have to follow where you're being led. So I use a phrase often, and I say, God can't steer a parked car because he can't. If you stay stagnant and you don't do anything and you want all your dreams to come true, but you're not taking that step forward, then it's not going to happen. But if you start moving, and even if you move in a direction that isn't going to get you to your goal, then God can steer you in the right way. The universe can steer you in the right way. So it's so important to take that step forward, because then if you don't, then you won't be.
Yeah, I completely agree. Completely agree. Awesome. So how, if we wanted to get and like support your, either your nonprofit or support you and your endeavors or even work with you, um, how could we get in contact with you and how could we help you? How could the Fuel Your Legacy audience become more engaged with you?
Awesome. Yeah, there's a couple of ways. So if you go to unsilencedvoices.org, you can get information about the nonprofit. We're looking for grant writers right now. We're also looking for some assistance. And then in the LA area, we're doing our first event where we're going to be providing legal assistance and resources to survivors and also educating the community. So we need help with that event. We need sponsors, vendor sponsors, venue sponsor, lunch sponsor, speaker sponsors, you name it. So if you know of anybody, you can reach out to me at admin@michellejewsbury.com, MICHELLEJEWSBURY.com. And then if you're interested to learn more about our masterclass and our intensive and private coaching, you can go to unsilencemyvoice.com.
Awesome. And those links are going to be in the show notes here. And also her name will be on there, right there. So you'll be able to, if you're like, how does she spell that? It's all right there for you.
I'm all on social media too, so you can.
Yeah, no, you'll find her. She's awesome. So this is second to last section of the show. It's called Legacy on Rapid Fire. So I'm going to ask you 5 questions, looking for one word to one sentence answers. The first question has to be a sentence. Okay, you have to answer it with a question. I mean, you have to answer the question with a sentence. Okay. So the first question is, what do you believe is holding you back from reaching the next level of your legacy?
The only thing that I see that could be potentially holding me back would be the funding, but we're going to get that, so I'm not worried.
Okay, awesome. What do you think the hardest thing you've ever accomplished has been?
Hardest thing I ever accomplished. Probably that play. Writing and performing that play. That was so difficult, emotionally difficult and time-wise. I mean, I would rehearse that thing like 4 or 5 days a week.
Yeah, that's awesome. What do you think your greatest success at this point in your life is?
Being able to spread the message, traveling all over the world and being able to talk to.
Okay. And what do you think, if you were to share one secret that is a habit, mindset, or behavior that you believe has contributed most to your success, what would that be?
Just keep swimming.
Just keep swimming. Love it. Love it. And what books would you recommend to the Fuel Your Legacy audience?
So there's a couple. So I have a very good friend who wrote a book called Millennial Samurai. His name is George Chanos. And it's about the characteristics that are essential for the 21st century. And then the other book would be by John Maxwell called Failing Forward. Amazing book. And then, of course, Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon.
Awesome. I love the authors. That's good. I'll have to look up the Millennial Samurai. I haven't heard that one before. So
yeah, it's new. George Chanos is one of the most intelligent men I've ever met.
Cool. Yeah, well, I'm excited to read that one. Okay, so this is my favorite question. I saved it for last. The question is really focused around what legacy you're building, but this is the prep for the question. We're going to pretend that you've died. Okay, so you've been dead now for 6 generations. That could be anywhere from 100 to 200 years, depending on how big generational spans are. If you were to be dead, but be able to come back and watch your children or your great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren sitting around a table talking about your life and the impact that you had, what would you want them to be saying about you? What do you want your legacy to be at that point?
Unsilenced voices, for sure. So I'm on a mission to start and continue this movement to create equality between men and women, right? To create a world that we live in with no violence, without abuse. And Unsilenced Voices is that. So in 8 generations from now, when I am deceased, if we're still on this planet, I really foresee people talking about Michelle Jewsbury as the founder of Unsilenced Voices, and that the organization has created this sustained movement to create change.
That's awesome. I love it. I'm glad that you're already thinking. People are going to be thinking about me, not from a vanity perspective, but from how much impact did I really have? I don't think George Washington or Abraham Lincoln or any of those people were sitting there thinking, man, I'm just so vain. I hope people remember me. Napoleon did that. Not Napoleon Hill. The other Napoleon, he's remembered specifically because of his vanity, but not in a good way, right? So what do you want your legacy to be, and how are you intentionally creating that? I love that. So with that, we're going to wrap this up for today, but thank you so much for listening. If you, honestly, if you guys are in this situation or know somebody in this situation, please feel free to tag yourself or start a conversation. Reach out to Michelle on social media and just say, hey, I heard you on the Fuel Your Legacy podcast. I'd love to chat for a minute. I'm sure she'd be willing to do that. And then, if this is helpful to you and you want more people to hear it, share it and rank and review it on iTunes, Google, Spotify. Make sure that other people are actually able to hear this as well. I love doing this. It's one of my passions to share these messages with you. And I hope that you're also going and paying that forward and sharing it with others. So thank you so much, Michelle, for taking your time and joining us on here. Thanks for joining us. If what you heard today resonates with you, please like, comment, and share on social media. Tag me. And if you do give me a shout out, I'll give you a shout out on the next episode. Thanks to all of those who've left a review. It helps spread the message of what it takes to build a legacy that lasts. And we'll catch you next time on Fuel Your Legacy.